I'm going to try to get Chrome next time and see if I can actually view you, because it would be nice to be able to see.
It doesn't bounce to who's talking for you?
I don't see anything. I just see a black screen. So.
Yeah. It's way better to be able to see people.
Yeah, Chrome helps it out.
You did all right. You looked like you were blind sometimes, but I think it worked out.
Like Stevie Wonder playing the
exactly. You should have just put glasses on.
Yeah, you just look more wise that way. Like the
yeah.
blind guy always knows more.
Eric, can you just give lay out your article for us and for our millions of viewers?
Well, most of the millions will probably recognize that there's, I call it a crusade in the article, a little tongue-in-cheek. But the idea is that there are a lot of people out, a lot of Catholics and Christians in general that are out to get liberalism. Case against liberalism is teleological. It is assumed that liberals promote individualism, reason, and freedom above all else, including truth, community, and God himself. That freedom becomes a kind of God, and that we must deny the true God to enshrine freedom. I would consider myself a classical liberal and do not subscribe to that idea at all. I don't think that you need to deny God in order to promote freedom.
Yeah, let's just clear that up right off the bat. So, what is liberalism? And I know a lot of people fight the modern interpretation of liberal.
I think we can leave that definition of liberalism out of this. I mean, I think we all probably are clear that, the modern usage of liberal to mean like on the political left is not essentially what we're talking about. Right. And I think the way I would probably define liberalism is it's the elevation of reason over all forms of authority, so that all authority becomes subject to reason.
Reason is the ultimate authority.
Correct. That's what I would say is the foundation of liberalism, as I understand it.
Could you define reason a little bit more?
Let me think. The human faculty of reason, of trying to reach truth by reason, that there's no other epistemologically valid way to get to truth other than reason. So it privileges reason as the only avenue to truth.
So isn't that a bit of a straw man? Do you think that people say that that's the only source of truth? Because I think that it is a valid form of means to get to the truth, but it's not the only, and it certainly doesn't uproot other sources of truth.
Well, I would say in practice, it seems largely to have done that. I know that there are people such as yourselves who kind of are trying to hold both ends of that proposition. But in practice, it doesn't seem that works very well on a societal level.
Well, there are examples of people who say reason is the only means to come to the truth, right? And I think you can point to some Enlightenment thinkers, and I would say even more relevantly, like a Leonard Peikoff might be one. Although I don't know if he mentioned that specifically, but that type of thinker, I think, would make that case.
Right.
Yeah, reason leads beyond itself. Like, astrophysics can't prove or disprove the existence of God, and that's why it's a paradox.
Yeah, or science. Science can't prove that science is correct.
And so it indicates so you go from the language of proofs to reasonableness, so reason, the difference between reason and reasonableness being that it is reasonable for a person to believe in the existence of God, because he's reached the extent of himself, which is his reason.
It underscores Daniel's argument that this notion of elevating reason to the highest form of, or the only way of knowing truth, that there are problems with that, right? There are issues with consistency and even in the logic behind it.
Well, right. It can't be the only source of truth because that's in itself is unreasonable.
There you go. You need some other fundamental starting point.
Yeah, like you said, science can't prove that only that which is derived from science should be believed.
Right.
So if you take the form of classical liberalism that you would identify with, what would you say is the foundation of knowledge within your conception of that?
This is well, I think definitions are important because you bring up reason when we're talking about liberalism, and I don't even think about reason or epistemology at all necessarily when thinking about liberalism. I think when I think of liberalism, I think of the principle that basically that everyone should be able to do whatever they want as long as that doesn't infringe on the same right of others. So it's the principle that came out of the natural rights theories of St. Thomas Aquinas and then the school of Salamanca, and it stems from the idea that everyone is created equal under God and has equal dignity and rights under God, and those rights shouldn't be infringed or
so the ultimate source of authority in that framework is the individual.
Under God.
Say that again?
The individual. Right. So I think the language that Joe used was important, and I think this links up with Eric's expressed idea of Americanism, which is the ought not language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so versus rights language. So rights language versus like deprivation language, right? Like so, does the individual have a right to something?
Positive right.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I think you're getting at the difference between negative rights and positive rights.
Right, which indicates that one system comes from a group of people or a framework that assumes the existence of God, and the other, I don't know, it sounds more Rousseauian,
Yeah.
Which I guess is it generally accepted that Rousseau is sort of a forefather of Jacobin liberalism?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that gets to the distinction Joe's trying to make. So I forget where I read it, but they were quoting Bastiat, who made the distinction between political freedom and social freedom. And I think the idea with a lot of the people who are against liberalism is that they think that just because a group of people think that individuals should be their own sovereign power, they should have freedom to do what they will, that means that they necessarily think that they should be atomized, they shouldn't work with other people, and they shouldn't have any source of authority in the spiritual or theological realm.
Which is interesting because you cited the Latin root of liberal or liberalism, which is liberalis, and so they're the two meanings, right?
Yeah.
So the characteristics of the word being someone who's noble, generous, munificent, or befitting a free person, right? So someone who is free is also someone who is noble, generous, and munificent. And Right. So if we're gonna use that word in any context with any degree of, I guess, etymological integrity, then we'd have to say that it can only be a deist worldview.
Yeah, and I think Eric makes that point in the article that the ideas are inextricable. Like you can't have, let's say, freedom without responsibility. And I don't want to paraphrase it too much, but isn't that what you would say, Eric? That there's no love without freedom, and there's no freedom without love. So they're
Yeah.
inextricable.
Well, and
I think we're to some degree talking about two different things still, because
yeah,
I think one of the things we're talking about is liberalism as like political order, and the other thing that we're talking about is liberalism like a philosophical change that took place with Enlightenment liberalism and this question of authority that I'm trying to address. And I think when it comes to political order, a lot of the arguments you're making are, pragmatically, this seems like the best way to order society, and can you come up with a better way to do it? I mean, and that argument is fairly compelling, especially at this point in time. But I think that's a little different than the question that some of the critics of liberalism that I've read are trying to get to, which is that it's more the philosophical underpinnings of liberalism that are the real problem.
Yeah, so you're talking about them two separate things. Can we say that they're different? So every time we hear the critics, they say like, yeah, you can't be a libertarian because it's rooted in Enlightenment thinking, and that's a bad word, and there's no other basis for it, and you also worship yourself, the individual, and there's no room for God in there. But clearly there is. So we're either not talking about the same thing or they're wrong.
Or are we, if you make an argument that says, okay, pragmatically in terms of ordering society, this is the best way to do it, and God fits into that as part of the way of best ordering society, are we in some way diminishing God by reducing God to like a pragmatic answer to how best order society? Like, who was it? Irving Kristol maybe, that said, like, hey, people need God, society needs God, because otherwise it just won't work. And that might be true, but it's kind of a terrible argument for God, because it's not an argument for a living God. It's an argument just for a philosophical God who can sort of, or even worse than that, just a pragmatic God who can help make things work better.
Well, I disagree if we say that society needs God in order to function in any sort of semblance of order. And also that's why society keeps evolving and we can't come up with a perfect system, because we're constantly chasing after the heavenly city, and we're not there yet.
In fact, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do.
How do you mean? Which part of it is dangerous?
I think trying to create the heavenly city is a delusion, which...
Oh, certainly. I think maybe what I mean by that is just pursuing the best possible system for an imperfect world, but not the delusional utopia,
Well, so
right.
This may be a little tangential, but I'm interested in it because in our Lord's Prayer, He says, "On earth as it is in heaven." Now, what does that say to you?
Well, what's the preceding clause, though?
Right. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Right. So what does that say to you? Does that say that we shouldn't try or attempt to create God's kingdom on earth, or that we should?
So I guess that's a question of how
Or is that a false dichotomy?
Political ideas interface with evangelism.
I would put the point of emphasis on thy kingdom come, thy will be done. So part of that is not my will be done.
Right. Makes
But
sense.
you can do God's will here on earth. I think that's what that's trying to say.
Maybe Daniel's referring to that being, maybe that's the death knell for liberalism.
I know he's trying to make that claim, but no, and
Maybe it is though. I mean, like, so I've always had, I guess, these two contradicting thoughts in my head. One is most people are idiots. I don't like the fact that, you know, they have the freedoms that they have because they don't know what to do with them, and usually they just end up with like 20 kids by 30 women.
I was gonna say there's nothing wrong with 20 kids, but by 30 women,
The 30 women part.
that gets problematic.
And then the other thought has been, well, no, like, you know, the government constantly imposing its wishes on the people is wrong. And in fact, I was thinking that today as I reviewed my living ledger and amount of taxes that are withheld.
Aha.
So I think that Christianity demands some kind of workable paradox in relationship between the two, where every man is a king, but also one man is a king.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good way of putting it, because you do need to simultaneously respect the free will of each person, but at the same time, you realize that you're completely and utterly dependent. And it's kind of like, you know, the Our Father. We're dependent on thy will be done, thy kingdom done. Because, you know, so it's...
Right.
Yeah, and I think classical liberalism has no problem with that. The problem is when people start to say you're dependent on other people, and this other human being who is equally fallen is going to dictate your life and do things, and force you to do things. That's where liberalism has a problem, and I don't know how we can avoid that circumstance if we get rid of liberalism.
Is that problem that you just mentioned, though, where does that fall in the hierarchy of problems to address? I think that's an important question to ask.
I think it's paramount these days. Other people dictating what we do is the primary social problem of our age, and the social problems are pretty paramount as far as problems go.
As I understand it, if we go back for just a minute to the thy kingdom concept, my understanding is that Christ becoming incarnate and being crucified and being resurrected is the institution of that kingdom on earth, and that being in the church is to be in the kingdom of God. It's not something that we are waiting for any longer. It's something that is being established from that eternal, transcendent moment.
Yeah,
Right.
I could see that. And I think I haven't read the entire thing, but I think that's what Augustine was going for in City of God, right? So there are two separate cities. There is the earthly city, and then there's the city of God, which
Right.
Christians are a part of. But I think that also reinforces the idea that all governments are subject to corruption and evil. The city of God isn't, but all earthly kingdoms are, and so there is going to be that separation. and that it shouldn't be unified.
Mm-hmm.
Or it can't be.
Right. And so I would say that if we're called to be in the kingdom of God, then our highest calling is a kind of vertical communion, transcendent communion with God, and a kind of horizontal communion across time and space with our fellow beings, our fellow men. Mm-hmm. And I would see that kind of vertical and horizontal communion is the purpose of our lives. And that's the highest calling.
I love the allusion to the cross there, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's good, and I think with what you said, in that this issue is paramount, I would say it's paramount if it disrupts that cross that Dan just described. The concern is only paramount in those cases when it disrupts that cross, that lateral and vertical communion. And so, for instance, let's say the state, the governing body is telling me you need to pay 40% taxes on your income, and we're going to use it for, obviously, in the majority of cases, some nonsensical project that is probably full of fraud and abuse and, whatever. But that tax on me, despite its, in the majority of cases, despite its, I would say, inconsistency with reason, is not the greatest attack, or even maybe a significant attack necessarily on the things that really matter, namely vertical and horizontal communion.
Yeah, so you're saying it's not causing you to sin.
Right.
Taxation doesn't cause you to sin. So
it's not necessarily causing a separation from God or from other people.
Yeah.
Although I would say that some of these programs, I think, dehumanize people, and that they treat them as a need rather than a human, which I think that can be a little more grave, because it really cuts people
for sure
down.
Well, yeah, and take the extreme. So the government takes our money and sends it to Planned Parenthood, which then uses it to kill babies. So or
the ultimate affront against liberalism.
Pursue unjust wars abroad, right? So
also an affront against.
Take the extreme to better understand it. Is that a paramount issue? Are we a party to sin because of it?
This has always bothered me. That's always bothered me, how easily people can, rant on and on about, how, especially appealing to reason, how stupid abortion is, since we're talking about reason and liberalism. But at the same time, if we want to talk about reason and liberalism, what's a reasonable response to the horrific Holocaust of abortion? What was a reasonable response to, for instance, Auschwitz and Dachau, in relation to the political ideal of freedom and, of course, our Catholic instincts? Because I think that's at the heart of the whole conversation, right?
Yeah.
It really is. I think that is the central issue defining this conversation and every other conversation about political freedoms.
Well, yeah, and I think there are a lot of people that say abortion is the offshoot, is the product of liberalism, right? There are a lot of these critics of liberalism that point to Justice Kennedy's wild, crazy musings about what liberty is, and basically how to define it allows you to define reality in his defense of abortion. So yeah, there are a lot of people that say that liberalism brings about abortion and it defends abortion.
Right, those people would be unreasonable.
I don't know, I think there is something to the idea that part of the modern world is a cult of agency, and that what it means to be human in the modern world is to have agency.
Yeah.
So for instance, nothing's worse than hierarchy, because that means that your agency is somewhat limited by whoever is above you in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And by the same measure, somebody who doesn't have agency, the unborn or the infirm, can be gotten rid of because they actually aren't a human being. The very definition of being human in modernity is to have agency, and I think that does tie into some liberal principles.
Well, you would agree, Dan, that even in our corrupt, twisted society, the standard, at least for the time being, is that the infirm, the old, and to some degree the unborn, we see it as an obligation to defend those people, right?
Well, certainly from a Christian point of view, yes.
Yeah, and as much as our culture is built on Christian ideals, we defend those less capable.
Yeah.
I think from an enlightened perspective it is too. If we're talking about reason and science, right, those two things, those two illuminators.
That's for sure.
Then we have to do it. That's why, again, we always run into the issue of, like, you have to be a deist to be a liberal. Like, I think that's, you can't be a liberal and not believe in God.
Part of the assertion of liberalism from the beginning is, I don't want there to be an authority over me who is unjust, and so authority should be subject to reason. So there is a sort of liberation of the individual's will and agency that is a rejection of authority that's based on superstition or mere tradition or whatever. And so that does tie into this cult of agency. I mean, I think there is something there from the beginning.
Yeah, and I would agree with that rejection of an unjust authority is a basis for liberalism, classical liberalism. And so, looking at reason, for instance, I think it is, people may think that abortion is justifiable by reason and science. But then someone who understands science and understands logic, for instance, would easily be able to dismantle that argument. So,
right. So let's assume that let's assume we've crossed that barrier because we have someone who's intellectually honest, which, maybe 0.04% of the population in America is intellectually honest. So let's just go with it. And then let's say, okay, now that we've gotten to that point, like what does, based on the ideals of classical liberalism, because it's the only reasonable form of liberalism, what is the proper response to abortion and the fact that our participation in it within our political system is compulsory?
I think, of course, you can't ignore the moral problem of abortion, but I also think that there is, in some sense, the reality that, as far as how best to order the kingdom of man, right? It's not really the critical question to Christians. I think we make a mistake if we place ordering the kingdom of man too high on our list of priorities.
Let me try to respond to that, because I think it is of the utmost importance, because the political ideology that I espouse is the non-aggression principle, libertarian principles of individual freedom based on natural rights under God. And the opposite of that ideology led to over 100 million deaths through democide in the last century, continues to oppress people throughout the world today, turns resource-rich countries into Hunger Games, basically, literally, and so I think it is of the utmost importance. And so when people give they accept this idea that government is a legitimate authority no matter what, and we should obey them, obey the government's dictates, and not try to fight that, and just give in to the wise paternal state, or even push for more power to the state, which is happening all over the place. From left and right, people are making that argument. I think there is a real threat or risk there of repeating some of the things that we saw in the 20th century.
We're doing that, though. We're just doing it more effectively.
We're doing what? We're doing the killing.
We did not know the concentration camp was 2 miles away from town.
Exactly.
Yeah. So to build on that, it seems like, Daniel, it seems like you might be confused. We might confuse you as saying it doesn't matter that these governments are going off and killing a bunch of people. It doesn't matter that they're sending money to Planned Parenthood for abortions. What we need to focus on is how to get to heaven.
Yeah, I'm not quite saying that. I mean, you could see it that way, but...
So clarify it, please.
Okay, let me...
Thank you, Eric.
There's something that all the slaughter in the last, however 100 years or whatever has in common, which is that it's all really part of the modern era, and in some way that is all birthed by liberalism, because I think if we go to the concept of time, for instance, traditional societies would have a more cyclical idea of time, and that's because they're looking to some past point, and the society is oriented around some past point or myth or person, and so there's a continuity. The big change that happens when you get rid of the authority of the past myth, person, what have you, is then you become oriented toward the future, where there's an infinite number of points. So one problem with that is that now we've all got a different ideal, and we're all pushing in wildly different directions amongst an infinite number of possible points that we should orient our society around. That is just has an obvious problem of it being basically chaos and basically constant conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the modern project. All these different, whether it's communism, whether it's Nazism, whether, even to some degree, our American project of building the shining city, it's some future point that we're oriented around. And once you leave behind being oriented around a past point, which for us, the apex of all history is Christ. And when we leave that, then we're inviting people to sacrifice the principles that are the fruit of Christianity in pursuit of the new thing that they want to orient around.
2 questions. So one, isn't it possible that Christ is also the future point for a lot of these?
Well, I would say not possible. I would say truth is the beginning and end of things, and that is Christ. That is the love.
But for liberalism, you mean, right, Eric?
Yeah. So why is it always assumed that these liberal projects cannot possibly use that? Why do they have to be an infinite amount of endpoints and not the one true endpoint?
Because the one true one is not a future-oriented point. It's a point that is in the past, which is transcendent, which transcends time.
It's kind of like what St. Paul says about salvation. It was then, it is now, and it is coming.
Right.
But no, I think I do, to some extent I agree with Eric in saying that there's a point of view, there's a valid point of view that might say that classical liberalism is ordered towards, can be ordered towards, maybe, is the better way of putting it, Christ. as its center because it liberates the individual to inhabit the domestic church without inhibitions.
Yeah, I'm not sure what distinguishes that. I'm not sure what would distinguish that definition of liberalism from Christianity necessarily.
Right.
Which maybe is what you're trying to say, but I think that's a in some ways an untrue definition of liberalism because you're just using the same word to describe something else. But the liberal revolution was something else. It was a rejection of authority.
Unjust authority.
Sure, but that creates a problem because then how do you determine what's just? And presumably through reason, but how do you get everybody to agree on that principle when once they're unified, not around a past point, but sort of scattered toward infinite future possible points of what is justice?
Well, philosophy was always the unbiased authority throughout history, right? So I think that was the appeal. I think that's why it's so easy for classical liberalism to live with Christianity at the same time. So easy for it to fail, because the closer you get to truth, the narrower the road becomes, the deeper the chasms on either side. The ultimate ideal of the classical liberal is that he's a king in his own home. And the ultimate ideal of, let's just keep using the word Jacobin. Jacobin liberalism is that every man is a tyrant in his own home. It's just as easy to be aligned with Christianity as it is to be aligned with, Satanism, really. But I think that's because, it's getting there, it's getting closer, it's progressing towards that point where a man has more virtue as a Christian because it's not compulsory.
Yeah, it gets to the heart of what it means to be Christian, and can you be forced to be Christian? And so if there was this idealized Christian state that I think people are promoting, what does that mean to the people who aren't Christian? Or does that force them to be Christian? And what does that even mean? Can you be forced to profess Christ? And I would say no.
Well, baptism is an interesting conversation then, I guess. This might lead us into a minefield here. Because there's objectivity, right, to behaviors. Now, of course, there's still the individual's disposition of heart is always the most important thing, but there is objectivity to certain actions that are virtuous, right, or they're objectively good. I guess virtue is maybe a different conversation. So I might be compelled to do objectively good things and not want to do them, but at the same time I'm still accomplishing the good. I guess you could have the same conversation about sin and culpability. Of what merit is it? If I'm just doing these things because I'm forced to, which is why you still have to go through First Communion and confirmation. Right,
it has to be a voluntary decision at some point, and when you're at the age of reason, then that's the only point where you can start sinning, actually.
Right.
And then that's, I think, on the flip side of that, that's the only time that you can really. The age of reason.
Age of reason.
And on the flip side, that's the only time that you can start to love truly, right? You can have these emotions, or whatever, but unless you choose, the good of the other, then it's not really love, and that's at the age of reason as well. Mic drop.
As a father, I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah, I think the age of reason, is kind of arbitrary, right? There's that kid. Have you all seen that video of that kid who talks about gravity and how gravity is essentially like nothingness?
Yeah, we just.
You know what I'm talking? You all know what I'm talking about? He's like 8 years old and he's.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, yeah. So I think that kid probably reached the age of reason before, some other kids. but yeah, I mean, I think that, and maybe classical liberalism is really just an attempt to define a social Christianity, right?
Interesting.
What do you mean by that? Because I'm not sure. To me, like, social Christianity can only be social, just as justice can only be social. So social justice, the term is always,
Yeah,
you think it's stupid because it's like, okay, justice. But anyway.
justice. Yeah, I guess I mean, there's so many words that probably would just kind of roll into each other if we thought about it. I guess I meant just that, it's like what do politics look like when they're Christian? Maybe that's all it was. It's kind of like a project. Hey, what would politics look like if they were 100% Christian with no problems? Oh, they would be classically liberal. So maybe it's not much more than that, but maybe that's kind of like a wild assertion.
No, I think that's fair. I think
I'm okay with that.
I think that's fair. It's trying to build a society using the Christian virtues. So, society is oriented around Christ, and you produce a Christian society, and then you take the virtues of that society and you say, well, how could we use this to order society even more perfectly?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big mistake. But it seems like a harmless thing to do. It seems like a good idea. Why not try it? But I think it is a big mistake because it's very hard for people to be oriented around more than one thing at a time. And when you orient yourself around the virtues rather than around Christ directly, things can become lopsided and out of whack very easily. Like looking at Eric's two examples of liberalism that he provided with, kind of the French version and the American version, and how you have individualism in one and fraternity in the other, but both of those things are expressions of a Christian virtue, and to select one and orient around it is going to be at the expense of the other.
So this is really fascinating. So there are clearly two different strains in the Enlightenment that coming out of the Enlightenment, and I think people mistake libertarianism for just, I guess, the only one. But there are clearly two: the French mistake and the American, I think, success. And so you're saying that both are a result, ignoring one and stressing another virtue.
Yeah, it's like we're missing the bullseye. If Christ is the bullseye, and then in the circumference around that, you have these different virtues, and every virtue kind of has an opposite paradoxical virtue. So brotherhood really is a virtue, and the individual, the sacredness of the individual, is sort of another expression of that on the opposite side of the circle. And if you stay balanced in the middle, you can hold both of those paradoxical things together, and they're both true, they're both good. But if we start trying to pick one of the virtues to be oriented around, then we lose balance.
Absolutely. And I think one distinction, why does fraternity not work in the second form of liberalism? And the answer is that you can't force it, whereas you can force liberty. Liberty is a negative freedom. Fraternity is a positive freedom.
Yeah.
And
right, going to church on Sunday.
Right.
Yeah. Can you force that?
You can't force it. You can encourage it.
And the issue is, what we're talking about is when we're talking about building a society, we're talking about forming the official construct that people are basically forced to follow for this society to work, and that means you either do it or you punish people for not doing it. And the only thing that you can do, you have very limited amounts of rules that you can build such a society on, and it comes down to the three rights: liberty, life, liberty, and property. And anytime you start to build these more positive rights into a social framework, you run into problems.
Leftist Victorianism.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
going along with that, what life, liberty, and property, they all demand, and I think this was part of the genius of the American versus the French Revolution, is that the American Revolution not only looked to the past, rather than solely to the future, kind of like what Dan was saying, but they also recognize the fact that life, liberty, and property, if you're going to elevate those things, you also have to elevate at the same time virtue, which entails some sort of hierarchy of or authority. In
Right.
How so?
Well, how did they do that? Yeah, build it
well,
in.
I think some of them said it explicitly. Some of the founders, I think it was Madison or Jefferson or someone who said that our republic is only fit for a virtuous people. George Washington did said things along the same line in his farewell address.
John Adams as well.
And the de Tocqueville, I think, might have mentioned, but it's, I think it's something that if you're going to, recognize the value of certain things like life, liberty, property, then they have to be oriented and connected with something else that gives them some sort of orientation, direction, teleology, which is virtue, which is basically God's life. Virtuous life is the life of Christ.
Something assigns them meaning. Yeah, you don't just assert, hey, we value these things without an explanation.
Right.
And we don't. I don't think any of us need to cite anything to know that the those people who got together, compiled the documents, and ultimately formed the first government knew where that value came from.
So yeah, I think we can all agree that it's necessary. Like there needs to be some moral foundation for a society to work on liberal principles. But I guess the question is, can you instill that moral foundation into the government in any successful way?